There's a question that circulates quietly inside every palace, every corporation, every syndicate that has ever existed. New arrivals rarely hear it spoken aloud. They learn it by watching. It isn't who's in charge. That question is for outsiders, for the public, for journalists, for anyone reading a hierarchy from the outside in. Insiders learn to ask something sharper. Who, in this room, can disappear without the system even flinching? Because once you know who's expendable, you know something far more useful than who holds a title. You know where the real weight sits. You know who was never actually meant to be the center of the story, only its most visible surface. This is the architecture beneath almost every structure of power that has ever lasted. And once you learn to see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Ruling directly seems, on the surface, like the purest form of control. No filters, no middlemen. The decision comes from the top and lands exactly where it was meant to land. But direct power has a structural weakness that every sophisticated system eventually learns to correct. It leaves no distance between the decision and the person who made it. Every unpopular order, every punishment, every compromise made to keep a system running, all of it lands on a single identifiable source. There's nowhere for consequence to go except straight back up the chain. Blame doesn't diffuse. Retaliation doesn't scatter. It concentrates precisely on whoever gave the order. This is expensive, not in money, in exposure. A ruler, an executive, a founder operating in the open is one bad decision away from becoming the story themselves. And once you become the story, you stop being the one who controls it. So power adapts the way any system under pressure adapts. It doesn't retreat. It delegates the exposure. It builds a layer between itself and the consequence. Someone close enough to execute the will of the center, but distant enough to take the fall if the decision ever needs to be disowned. That layer has a name in almost every era of history. We just rarely call it what it is. Every enduring system of power builds some version of the same structure. A layer of people positioned between the source of authority and the consequences of using it. The advisor exists to be the one who recommended the unpopular policy, even when the direction was already decided before they entered the room. The fixer exists to handle the parts of the operation too messy for the official record. The negotiation nobody wants documented, the problem that needs to disappear quietly. The front man exists to be the face on the license, the signature on the contract, the name the public associates with an operation that was never truly his to run. Then there are the structures that don't even have a face at all. Boards that vote in ways already decided elsewhere. Foundations that distribute influence without appearing to hold any. Shell entities that own the asset, so no single person has to. Each of these serves the same underlying function, dressed differently depending on the era and the institution. Absorb the risk, execute the will, and remain detachable. Not because any single one of them is disposable as a person, but because the role is engineered to be disposable, so the center of power never has to be. Once you see this pattern, you realize it isn't unique to modern corporations or political scandals. It's one of the oldest architectures human beings have ever built. Long before corporations had spokespeople or governments had press secretaries, royal courts had already perfected this design. Emperors ruled through chancellors and chief ministers who carried out the harshest decrees in the sovereign's name. Decrees the sovereign could later distance themselves from if the political wind shifted. Court advisors absorbed the resentment of unpopular taxes and wars, while the throne remained, symbolically, above reproach. In some imperial systems, entire administrative classes existed for the sole purpose of standing between the ruler and the machinery of enforcement. Visible enough to be blamed, replaceable enough to never threaten succession. Criminal hierarchies centuries later rediscovered the same logic independently. The person who carries out an order is rarely the person who benefits most from it. Layers of command exist precisely so that the ones at the top can maintain distance, legal, reputational, and psychological, from the operations that sustain them. In modern corporations, Whatever their polish, run on an almost identical skeleton. Boards exist partly to formalize decisions. Spokespeople exist to deliver messages that shareholders or founders would rather not say directly. Middle management often exists to be the face of decisions made 2 or 3 levels above them. The costumes change. The org charts change. The language softens with every century. But the underlying design, insulate the source, expose the surface, repeats itself with remarkable consistency. It isn't a conspiracy. It's closer to a survival trait, the same way certain biological structures evolve independently across unrelated species because they solve the same fundamental problem. The problem, in this case, isn't biological. It's psychological. Most explanations for the buffer layer stop at legal protection. Distance reduces liability. Distance limits exposure to lawsuits, scandal, prosecution. That's true, but it's not the whole story. Something quieter is happening underneath the legal logic. The buffer doesn't just protect the powerful from consequence. It protects them from having to know. When a decision passes through several hands before it becomes an action, the person at the top can genuinely believe they never asked for the specific outcome that occurred. They asked for results. They asked for the problem to be handled. The unpleasant particulars were filled in somewhere further down the chain, by someone who understood, without being told directly, what was expected. This is what makes the architecture so durable. It isn't only functional, it's comforting. It allows someone to hold enormous power while preserving an internal narrative of their own decency, because they were never technically the one who gave the final, ugly instruction. Psychologists who study organizational behavior have long noted a version of this. Responsibility becomes harder to feel personally the more steps separate a decision-maker from its outcome. Power doesn't just use this distance strategically. It relies on it emotionally. The buffer, in other words, isn't just built to fool the public. It's built, in part, to let the powerful continue believing something forgiving about themselves. What's changed in the modern era isn't the logic, it's the scale and the sophistication of the disguise. Consultants now exist as an entire industry built partly around this function. A company can commission a report recommending layoffs, restructuring, or a controversial strategy. And when the backlash arrives, the decision appears to have originated from an independent outside analysis, rather than from the leadership that hired the consultant knowing exactly what conclusion they wanted. Boards marketed as independent often include members who owe their position, directly or indirectly, to the very leadership they're meant to oversee. Nonprofit foundations can move enormous influence through causes and grants while remaining legally and reputationally separate from the individuals who fund and direct them. Complex ownership structures, layers of holding companies, trusts, and shell entities can make it genuinely difficult to answer a simple question. Who actually controls this? And now there's a newer layer still, one that doesn't even require a person. Algorithms and automated systems can enforce decisions, filter outcomes, and allocate consequences at scale, while the humans who designed them retain a convenient distance. The system decided, not us. None of this required a single grand conspiracy to build. It emerged the way most durable architecture emerges, through thousands of individual actors across different institutions, independently arriving at the same conclusion. That power lasts longer when it's difficult to locate. Once you understand this pattern, you stop reading power the way most people do. You stop assuming the name on the door is the source, and start asking who that name protects. You stop assuming the spokesperson believes what they're saying, and start asking who wrote the words they're required to deliver. You stop asking who will be blamed if something goes wrong, and start asking, more usefully, who is structurally incapable of being blamed at all. That second question is the real signal. Not who sits highest in the hierarchy, but who the hierarchy was built to protect no matter what happens beneath them. The higher someone sits above consequence, immune not through virtue, but through architecture, the closer you are to finding where power actually lives. It's a small shift in perspective, but once it's learned, it's very hard to unlearn. Power has never needed to be visible to be real. It has only needed distance, enough layers between the decision and the consequence that no single point of failure can ever reach it. Every era builds this distance differently. The names change. The costumes change. The titles evolve from chancellor to consultant, from courtier to board member, from decree to algorithm. A vizier once stood where an outside, independent report now stands. A royal executioner once stood where a compliance department now stands. The function never disappears. It only finds a more presentable shape. And this is perhaps the deeper truth beneath the whole pattern. Systems don't build buffers because the people at the top are uniquely dishonest. They build them because unmediated power is unstable by nature. A decision with no distance from its consequence eventually collides with something it cannot survive. A rival, a public, a reckoning. So power learns, almost instinctively, to put something between itself and the moment of impact. Not out of malice, out of the same logic that makes a body grow calluses where it takes repeated pressure. Which means the buffer layer isn't really a flaw in power. It's a feature of anything built to last. So the next time a decision seems to have no clear author, when a scandal traces back to an independent panel, when a controversial choice is attributed to a consultant's recommendation, when a system, rather than a person, is blamed for an outcome, resist the urge to see it as confusion or coincidence. Ask the insider's question instead. Not who is standing in the light. Ask who was never meant to be found. The names change. The architecture remains.